All right, welcome back everyone for another deep dive, and today we're gonna be tackling a story that's developing pretty rapidly right now. The arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian grad student over at Columbia University.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a big one, and we've got a lot of sources kind of flying at us from all different directions. So we've got, obviously, your typical breaking news stuff from AP, Reuters.
Sure.
We've got a little bit from Fox, a little bit from the BBC even. And then just a ton of legal analyses, some briefing documents, trying to kind of connect the dots on this one.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going to be a complicated one for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, this isn't just about one arrest, right? Like this is touching on freedom of speech on campus. This is international relations. This is like power dynamics between the government and university.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty high stakes situation.
Huge. Yeah. So to jump right in, I mean, what really struck me right off the bat is who this guy is, like Mahmoud Khalil, right?
Right.
He's a Palestinian guy, grew up in a refugee camp in Syria, worked for the British embassy in Beirut before coming to the U.S.
Wow, what a background.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And legal permanent resident here, like green card, married to an American citizen who is, and this is important, 8 months pregnant at the time of his arrest.
Oh, wow. That adds a whole other layer to this, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then you've got the backdrop of the Columbia protests, right? So these erupted after the Hamas attacks on Israel back in 2023 and the subsequent war in Gaza.
Yeah.
And the sources are painting this picture of a campus that's just like deeply divided, strong emotions on both sides.
Sure. That makes sense. It's a very contentious issue.
And Khalil is right in the thick of it. He is like a lead negotiator for these student groups.
Really?
They set up a tent encampment on campus demanding that Columbia divest from companies that support the Israeli military.
So he's right in the middle of things.
Yeah, very, very active, very vocal.
I see.
And what's really interesting is that Columbia was already investigating him before this arrest.
Oh, really? For his protest activities or?
Well, they were looking into allegations that he had organized an event that some saw as glorifying the Hamas attacks, and then also that he was circulating social media posts that were critical of Zionism.
Oh, so it's more than just the protests themselves. It's also like his messaging and the content of his speech that's being scrutinized.
Exactly.
Wow.
So you have these protests already happening. You have a university investigation that's ongoing.
Right.
And then March 8th, 2025, ICE agents arrest Khalil at his university-owned residence.
Hold on. So ICE's involved in that.
ICE is involved, yeah. And it gets even crazier because according to some of the sources, the ICE agents initially said they were there to revoke his student visa.
But he had a green card, right?
Exactly. Doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
And then they were like, oh, okay, green card, we're revoking that.
And they changed their story.
They shifted the focus, yeah. And then they also reportedly threatened his pregnant wife with arrest.
That's, wow. I mean, that sounds like a very tense and confusing situation.
Incredibly. And it raises all sorts of questions about what ICE was really doing there and why. Like, was this a legitimate immigration action or was there something else going on?
Yeah. It definitely seems like there's more to the story than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. And to understand that, we've got to zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger political context.
Okay, so what's going on politically that might be influencing this situation?
Well, the Trump administration had explicitly said that they were going to target international students who are involved in these pro-Palestinian protests, basically saying, like, if you're doing this, you're supporting Hamas and we're going to deport you.
So they were equating pro-Palestinian activism with support for terrorism.
Right.
All right.
And in one of the sources, we've got Secretary of State Marco Rubio actually confirming this policy on social media, saying that visas and green cards of Hamas supporters would be revoked.
So it sounds like they were actively looking for people to target with this policy.
Yeah, and it seems like Khalil might be one of the first.
Yeah.
And that raises a huge question, right? If Khalil, legal permanent resident, green card, married to an American citizen, if he can be detained for expressing political views, especially views that are critical of U.S. foreign policy or Israel, what does that mean for anyone else? What does that mean for other international students who might want to speak out or, engage in political discourse?
Yeah, that's a really scary thought. If this is the precedent that's being set, it could have a chilling effect on free speech on campuses all over the country.
Absolutely. And to really understand that, we need to kind of dive into the legal arguments that are being made in Khalil's case.
Okay, so what are the legal grounds for his detention, and what are his lawyers saying about it?
Well, one of the things that really jumps out in these legal analyses is that Khalil's lawyer has filed a habeas corpus petition. Have you heard of that before?
I've heard of it, but I don't really know what it means in a legal context.
So it's basically a way to challenge the legality of someone's detention. So they're saying like, hey, you're holding this guy. Is that even legal? Are you violating his constitutional rights?
Oh, I see. So they're essentially saying that the government had no right to detain him in the first place.
Exactly. And the outcome of this petition could have like massive implications for Khalil, obviously, but also for other international students and their ability to speak freely on campus.
Right, so this is a much bigger issue than just one arrest.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, now that we have a better understanding of who Mahmoud Khalil is and the context surrounding his arrest, I'm really interested in digging deeper into the specifics of the legal battle and what exactly he's being accused of.
Me too, and we're going to do just that, but first.
So before we really get into the weeds here, we got to remember the bigger picture, right? This whole thing is happening against this backdrop of huge political polarization, and universities are under this microscope, especially when it comes to Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, you're right. It's like walking on eggshells.
Total minefield.
So, okay, let's try to break down these specific allegations against Khalil.
Okay.
What exactly was Columbia investigating him for?
Okay, well, one of the sources we've got is actually a briefing document directly from Columbia.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it kind of details their concerns. So
Yeah.
one thing is his involvement with this group, the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Group.
Right. I remember them. They were the ones pushing for Columbia to divest from companies that support the Israeli military, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which obviously is a very controversial stance.
Website time, yeah.
And then there's this whole thing about an event that he allegedly helped organize.
Oh, right. The one that was supposedly glorifying the Hamas attacks.
Yeah, exactly. And then on top of that, you've got his social media posts criticizing Zionism.
So it's not just about the protests themselves, but also what he's actually saying and writing.
Exactly. It's about the content of his speech and whether it crosses some kind of line.
It makes you wonder, what is that line? Where do you draw it?
That's a good question. And it's important to note that Khalil himself denies a lot of these allegations.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his lawyer is arguing that a lot of this stuff is taken out of context or blown way out of proportion. And that even if he did do all the things they're saying, it's still protected under the First Amendment.
Right, free speech and all that.
Exactly. And that's where this case gets so tricky, because it really comes down to this question of how do you balance free speech with the potential for harmful rhetoric, especially on a college campus.
Yeah, because you want people to be able to express themselves freely, but at the same time, you don't want to create an environment where people feel unsafe or targeted.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance.
For sure. So, okay, let's talk about Columbia's role in all this.
Okay.
Did they overreach in their investigation of Khalil? Did they actually share information with the government that led to his arrest?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And honestly, the sources we have don't give us any clear answers. What we do know is that Columbia was under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration.
Oh, right, because of the whole anti-Semitism thing.
Exactly. They had even lost a ton of federal funding over it. Something like $400 million.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It's huge. So it's possible that they were just trying to appease the administration and maybe they were a little too eager to cooperate with ICE.
Yeah, even if they didn't directly hand over information.
Right. It just makes you wonder how much information sharing is going on between universities and law enforcement these days.
And where do you draw the line? How do you protect students' privacy and their academic freedom?
It's a tough call.
Definitely. And, other universities are going to be watching this case very closely, because if Columbia is seen as having played a role in Khalil's arrest, it could have a real chilling effect on campus activism across the country.
Yeah, students might be less likely to speak out if they think their university could turn around and report them to the feds.
Exactly. So the stakes are really high here.
For sure. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the actual legal challenges that Khalil is facing. We talked about the habeas corpus petition, but what are his chances of actually winning this thing?
Well, based on the legal analyses we've seen, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah.
His lawyer basically has to prove that ICE violated his due process rights and that the government was going after him for his political speech specifically, not because of any actual immigration violations.
Which is tough, right? Because the government has so much power when it comes to immigration.
And then you've got the whole Trump administration policy about deporting international students involved in pro-Palestinian activism.
Right, which his lawyer will probably argue is discriminatory and unconstitutional.
But is that going to be enough to convince a court?
It's hard to say. But there are some big players who are coming out in support of Khalil, like the ACLU and Shiar. They're calling this arrest a huge escalation in the government's attempts to silence dissent.
So they're basically saying this isn't just about one guy, it's about a much bigger principle.
Exactly. It's about protecting the right to free speech, even when it's unpopular or controversial.
And it's not just the big organizations, right? You've got student groups all over the country who are protesting and speaking out in support of Khalil.
It's really striking how much this case has resonated with people.
Yeah, it's clearly touched a nerve. I mean, it makes you wonder, what does this whole situation say about the state of free speech in America today? And what are the long-term consequences going to be, not just for Khalil, but for everyone?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think anyone knows the answer yet, but one thing is for sure, the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, if Khalil gets deported, it could send a message to international students that their right to free speech is basically meaningless.
Right. And it could also have a chilling effect on campus activism, making students and faculty afraid to speak out on important issues.
And then beyond the universities, it makes you wonder if the government can detain a legal permanent resident for his political views. What does that say about the future of free speech for all of us?
It's a pretty scary thought.
It is. This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface of a much bigger issue.
Definitely. And it's an issue that's unfolding right now as we speak. So where do we go from here? Like, what should our listener be paying attention to as this story develops? What are the key takeaways you want to leave them with?
Yeah, it feels like we're at this, crossroads, not just for Khalil, but for, the whole idea of free speech and academic freedom. These are supposed to be, core values of, America, of a democracy.
I think you're right. Yeah, it's not just a legal battle, right? It's about ideas. It's about our values as a country.
So for our listeners who are trying to wrap their heads around all this, what should they be watching for as this story, keeps going?
Well, the first thing is the habeas corpus petition.
Right.
What happens with that? If the court says, yeah, you're right, the government messed up, that could be a big win for Khalil. Maybe he even gets released.
Even if he loses.
Then he probably gets deported.
And that would be a huge blow, not just for him, but for other international students. It would send this message that you can't speak your mind, you can't criticize the government, especially when it comes to Israel.
Right. Yeah, so that's definitely something to watch. What else besides the legal stuff?
I'd say keep an eye on the universities.
Okay.
What are they going to do? Are they going to stand up to the government and defend their students? Or are they just going to roll over and stay quiet?
You're right, because if they don't push back, it could create this atmosphere of fear on campuses.
Exactly. Students might think twice before speaking out if they think their university is going to side with the government.
And what about the public? The whole conversation that's happening around this case, it feels like people are really divided.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people are defending Khalil's right to free speech. They're saying he should be able to say what he wants, even if it's unpopular.
And others are like, no way, this guy's supporting terrorism, he needs to go.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this is a complex issue.
Yeah.
There are valid concerns on both sides.
Totally. It's not black and white.
And it's so easy to get caught up in the rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
People want simple answers, good guys versus bad guys.
Right.
But it's just not that simple. And I think it's important to step back and try to understand where everyone's coming from.
Absolutely. To be empathetic,
Exactly. And to keep an open mind. Be willing to listen to people who disagree with you, to try to understand their perspective.
That's a really good point. I mean, it's something we should all strive for, especially in these times, right?
For sure. And I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah, I think so too. This deep dive has been, it's been a lot. It's been informative. It's been concerning. It's been a bit overwhelming, honestly.
It's definitely a lot to process.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the biggest takeaway here is that the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, it's not just some isolated incident. It's a symptom of something much bigger that's happening in our society right now.
You're right. Yeah, it's like a canary in the coal mine.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the freedoms we have, the things we often take for granted, they're not guaranteed. We have to fight for them. We have to be vigilant. We have to hold our leaders accountable.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, this journey into this really complex and evolving situation. We're going to keep following the story, and we'll keep you updated.
Sounds good.
But for now, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep thinking critically. We'll see you next time.